minute we can squeeze is a good idea. So my name is Robin Keller. I'm on the board of the Marin Coalition. I'm standing in for Scott Pinsky, our president, who came down with a bug and decided he didn't want to infect any more people than his wife. So I'm not a professional MC, which will become evident fairly soon. So thank you all for being here. Welcome to the Marin Coalition at Dominican. I'm glad you found us. This is a relatively new venue for us, so we always appreciate your feedback. Let us know at the end of the session what you thought. The Marin Coalition is a 501c3 organization. We've been in existence for 50 years. So hopefully what we call our conversations that matter actually do, because people keep coming to our events. Today we have a wonderful event. I want to talk briefly about the events that are coming up in April and May. We believe we have Representative Damon Connolly set for next month. I think on April 3rd, is that right, Stephen?
That's the
date
we're working on.
Okay, we're working on that. May 1st, we have the privilege to have Reyes, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Marin Community Foundation. You know, MCF is an organization that kind of flies under the radar, but they've donated over $2.5 billion to Marin, California, the United States, and the world. And Reyes is a relatively recent CEO, and I think it would be a fascinating experience for all of you to attend that as well. So please, everyone, please turn off our phones. And since I haven't done that myself, today we're talking about our Marin-Sonoma parks, Point Reyes, a very emotional topic for many people. We have 5 speakers today, which is usually a little bit more than we have today. And in order of their presentation, we have John Hart, Jim Coda, Eric Mulvar, Stephanie Moreta Arend. Did I pronounce that right? Aaron, thank you. And Jack Gescheit. If you're here, you obviously know the historic court settlement that occurred just recently in Point Reyes. Ranching in West Marin has existed for over 150 years and continued after Congress created the Reyes National Seashore in 1962. Much of the newly created park was occupied by historic ranches, but the federal act indicated a different future for the iconic peninsula. To acquire these ranches, the National Park Service purchased ranchers' property while giving them a lease back of up to 25 years. These leases were extended by the NPS many times over, and many of the ranches that existed 60 years ago are still there. During these decades, environmentalists sought to eliminate ranching at Point Reyes due to its adverse environmental impacts, believing that the entire park must be managed to ensure resource protection. Also, ranches are the basis for a barrier fencing that prevents the free roaming of the tule elk, a species that has faced deadly drought and starvation conditions due to their restricted terrain. On the other side, ranchers argued that Congress intended these lands to be managed forever as private ranches, not public parkland. They assert the ranchers provide jobs, food, and a vibrant community. A lawsuit to challenge the status quo has been pending for a number of years, which was recently, we thought, resolved through a voluntary settlement. That is the main topic of today's discussion. Our panel will provide an insider's view of how this controversy developed. I have to mention that in the last 3 weeks, there have been some developments. Number one, the occupants of the ranches have filed a motion to federal court for an appeal for that original decision. Furthermore, William Nyman, did I get that correct, John? Who is a rancher, has filed a suit in federal court on February 25th against the Park Service. A little bit about our panel. Researched a lot to try to find a balanced people to talk about these issues. And until recently, the folks that we found were largely on the side of the outcome of that lawsuit. Sophia popped up Stephanie, I'm sorry, pardon me. Stephanie popped up just a few days ago and offered to offer a slightly different perspective, and she is here today with us, and we're very pleased she's here. So a brief biography of each of the speakers. John Hart is a journalist and author of 16 books and many other published works. He won the James Fellon Award, the Commonwealth Club Medal in California, the David R. Brower Award for service in the field of conservation. He began his career in 1970 with articles for the Pacific Sun at a moment of historic policy change, reporting on local land use planning. Jim Cota began his legal career as an attorney in the Department of the Interior. He was involved in the reintroduction of the Tool the Elk to Point Reyes National Seashore in 1978, and in the litigation filed by a rancher challenging the reintroduction. He spent most of his legal career as an assistant U.S. attorney for the Northern District of California, where he handled cases primarily involving changes to the way federal agencies managed their lands and resources. Eric Mulvar is a wildlife biologist and executive director of Western Watersheds Project. He has published research on moose behavior and ecology and has written 17 guidebooks to national parks and wilderness areas across the American West. His work as a conservationist spans 25 years and includes forest defense, wilderness conservation, oil and gas issues, endangered species listing and protection, and livestock grazing reform. Finalizing the 2016 Point Reyes settlement was one of the first tasks at WWP, and he has also been heavily engaged in the Park Service General Management Plan, the lawsuit that challenged it, and the recent settlement that has emerged. Stephanie Murata Arend, did I get it that time? Arend, sorry. Currently helps her family manage their local farm, which straddles Sonoma and Marin counties. She is a fifth-generation farmer and currently spends most of her days on the farm her grandparents purchased over 100 years ago. She has spent the last decade battling various organizations looking to shut down the farm in our area, including her family's. She now has a small social media presence under the name Dairy Girl Dairies. I love that name. She now, which has made this debut during the campaign against Measure J. Today, she offers her input and experience to the non-farmer so that they may hear from the farmer perspective and offer what farmers here are truly the best in the world. Jack DeScheit is a full-time environmental activist, advocate, and artist since founding his Tree Spirit project in 2004. Tree Spirit raises awareness of the crucial role of trees and forests in our lives. Since 2020, he's been an activist on the ground at Point Reyes National Seashore, leading dozens of demonstrations and actions drawing attention to the ecological damage the beef and dairy ranches do both inside the park and elsewhere. So without further ado, let me introduce John Hart. Yeah. Okay.
Looking back, I see that I wrote my first article about the West Marin parks in September of 1970. It was called "You Can Help Plan Point Reyes Seashore." So I've been on this beat for a long, long time. Along the way, I've produced 4 books dealing pretty directly with this West Marin landscape. One was a celebration of the process by which the parks were created. One focused on the campaign to maintain West Marin agriculture as a bulwark against urbanization, which was a very keen threat at that time. A third was a 50th anniversary book, a history of Point Reyes itself. But the one that is on my mind today wasn't quite so locally focused. It was called Legacy, portraits of 50 Bay Area environmental leaders. It was the instigation of photographer Nancy Kittle. And the idea was to capture in image and story some 50 people who made their mark before the first Earth Day and had largely created the wonderfully well-conserved landscape that we enjoy and fight about today. Among the people profiled in this book were Huey Johnson, founder of the Resource Renewal Institute, Marty Griffin, who did so much at Bolinas Lagoon and other areas along the coast, Phyllis Faber, the instigator of the Marin Agricultural Land Trust, Ellen Strauss, the rancher conservationist, and a number more involved in West Marin. And one thing I'm going to quibble with anytime it arises tonight is the shorthand. This is a battle between environmentalists and ranchers. From the beginning, there have been environmentalists on both sides. And you cannot say that someone like Faber or Strauss was not a real environmentalist. These agreements, it's a bit like the shorthand by which we speak of California's labyrinthine water issues as farms versus fish. If I had a bumper sticker, it would be, it's more complicated than that. I like to look at the West Marin Parks debates in three levels. The first is the global and land use pattern background. How important are these decisions in the face of the onrushing planetary disaster? And this may be the only thing that no one in this room agrees with. It is not very important. This is a sideline. We face a choice between two potentially desirable outcomes, a rewilding, which poses many problems I'll touch on briefly, and the evolution of a environmentally superior, more sustainable restorative agriculture. Both of these are environmental causes. Here they collide, fighting over the same territory. And were I an activist, I would not invest my time on either side of this debate. There are bigger things going on by far. But I hear the audience thinking, how can you be so neutral? This is a national park. This is different. And it's true. These are national parks in spite of being called by other labels. They are governed by the Organic Act of 1916 and by various layers of Park Service policy. And it is true that system-wide, when you talk to Park Service people on the ground, there is quite a feeling that agriculture is intrinsically alien to parks and should be ejected. I just finished up an article for Bay Nature on this subject, and I was surprised to find that this Park Service culture is not necessarily reflected in what you might call black letter Park Service policy. The Organic Act itself is quite ambiguous in my view. And the latest system-wide policy guidance says that agriculture may be allowed if it does not result in unacceptable impacts to park resources, values, or purposes. And there is similar language I won't quote at length. But the door is at least a crack open to ag if founding legislation of particular units and local conditions actually justify it or permit. One of the clauses here says that grazing is permitted when required to maintain a historic scene. Fair enough, but these guidelines defer to the specific legislation that established each park. I know that Jim is going to go into this in much more detail than I can, and maybe I should have waited and listened to him first. But I found three sets of guidelines for these parks. When Point Reyes was originally founded, it was for purposes of public recreation, benefit, and inspiration, kind of ambiguous. The Park Service ran with that recreation ball and ran it into the ground. They had massive development plans, supposedly to service recreation, including things like a parkway from the Esteros down to Bolinas. Conservationists and the public in general rebelled. And in 1976, the Park Service issued, Congress rather, issued a sharp reprimand, prioritizing natural values above all else at Point Reyes. The other values than the natural ones are only to be served as consistent with, based upon, and supportive of the maximum protection, restoration, and preservation of the natural environment. The Park Service director of that day, who opposed this new language, said, among other things, that he thought that would exclude grazing. So I think that is one regime, and I think supporters of ag in Point Reyes have ever since had a rather steep hill to climb. The second law, fundamental law, established the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, including the Olima Valley, in 1972. Its language is much more general and ambiguous. And in 1978, Congress added about 6,000 acres to both parks. And in the legislation, it is specifically, the service is specifically authorized to do ag leasebacks. And in an accompanying committee report, the House committee called for the perpetuation of agricultural use. So it's a patchwork of quite three different directives. Most of the area that we're talking about in this recent settlement would fall under that first directive. So that's sort of Point Reyes as an abstract part of the national park system. Of course, that's not the way we experience it. We look to the law and policy to justify our pre-existing positions, but Point Reyes is above all a specific place with specific regional and biotic relationships. And there are three main headings here for me, two of which I will just touch on. The first is the enormous historical and cultural involvement of Point Reyes and the GGNRA. Others, I think, will speak to this more than I do. It's what most of the press coverage has been about. It's excited the deepest emotions out in West Marin. And I'm not going to go there. I think it's important, and that historic and cultural values are a value in the national park system, but let's others talk about that. The second is the alleged role of agriculture on Point Reyes in maintaining the ag economy throughout the North Bay. This used to be regarded as very important because in the 1970s, the county turned away from a policy of urbanizing the county all the way out to Tomales Bay to one of preserving it as a mixture of ag and parks. For a long time, it was unclear whether this would succeed. And it was felt that the whole structure could fall apart if a landowner could sue saying, look, agriculture is not paying anymore. I can't survive on this large lot that you're requiring I maintain. I'm suing against the zoning. There's a thing called the takings issue that could apply. I'm not sure that this is really a factor anymore. I need to do more research about this, but I'm not going to spend much time on that either. Maybe others will. But the third really unique and significant thing about Point Reyes to me and the GGNRA is the presence there of what's called the California Coastal Prairie, or sometimes the Northern Coastal Prairie. This is a particular and very limited in scope type of grassland, which like the redwoods, really only thrives in the fog belt. It is enormously rich biotically. Grasslands in general have more species diversity, at least on the plant side, than other communities. And the northern coastal prairie has more diversity than any other grassland in North America. It's really a precious thing. And it's in trouble due to urbanization, all kinds of degradation, intrusion of exotic species, in some places overgrazing. They say that only about 1% of it is in reasonably good condition. And that 1% is overwhelmingly in Point Reyes and the GGNRA. Our whole park complex could be dubbed the Northern Coastal Prairie Biotic Reserve, I think. And this particular biome or system depends for its continued existence on constant disturbance. Leaving it alone means that it will convert to brush fields, or in these days, it will convert to brush fields thickly seeded with exotic species like poison hemlock. In the old days, in the very old days, before human beings arrived on the scene, the disturbance was maintained by critters like mammoths and mastodons, giant sloths, and herds of bison. After what's called the Pleistocene extinction around 10,000 years ago, it was maintained by large herds of tule elk that came and went, and also apparently by Indian burning. For the last 150 years, it has been maintained largely by cattle. Now for Point Reyes, at least, we're turning into a fourth regime where we're going to try to maintain this prairie, and I think we should, by other means, which the Nature Conservancy tells us will necessarily involve cattle, just not resident cattle. There is a vast literature about the need to use cattle as a management tool to maintain certain landscapes and endangered species even. 70% of the East Bay regional parks are grazed. This is not a sweetheart deal with the industry. This is the land manager's ecological judgment of what is required. So as we go forward into this new regime, which I find very exciting, by the way, a rewilding or ecological recalibration, the word restoration is too loaded for me, on a vast scale. This is an exciting story, and I look forward very much to seeing how it unfolds, assuming there are no last-minute glitches in the arrangement. I'm just about done. There is some acreage left where the decision has not yet been made on the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, especially. And as I've mentioned, this is covered by somewhat different founding legislation. And it seems to me that the way might be open to a cooperative arrangement in which ranchers could cooperate in the maintenance of northern coastal prairie on these lands. The characteristic species on Point Reyes proper. Here I have to look at my note. Can't come up with it, sorry. But there is a characteristic lead species in the northern coastal prairie on the point. There is another one on Bolinas Ridge. It's the Dansonia or California oatgrass. And if I had a bumper sticker these days, I think it would say, save the oatgrass by whatever means turn out to be most efficacious. Thanks a lot.
Hey, John. Jim Coda.
Hi, I'm going to talk about Point Reyes, obviously. When I retired, I became a wildlife photographer and spent a lot of days at Point Reyes in the ranching area. It's a good place to photograph bobcats and tule elk and badgers and a number of other animals. Just before our event today, I looked back to my directory for photos and found that I could add up easily how many days I've spent in Point Reyes, in the Point Reyes ranching area. And I came up with a number of 239 days I've spent there basically all day since I retired. Well, since January of 2010. So I've seen a lot out there, and for a while I was just concentrating on animals, but I started to notice things that I thought were amiss, that where the environment was suffering a lot. And so I became very involved in this whole planning process. It's been going on since basically 2014. I'm going to talk about ranching inside the seashore. I am not going to talk about ranching outside the seashore. To me, that's a totally different issue. My view is, how should a park be managed, not how should ranching be managed. Let's see a show of hands. How many of you believe that Congress intended that ranching continue forever at Point Reyes? Raise your hand if you think Congress intended that it would continue forever. Oh,
We possibly know that.
well,
What do we
people have, well, first of all, I think you should wait until the Q&A for that.
Great,
Okay,
I'll be up there.
Okay. Well, anyway, that's what I'm going to talk about. And I see that it was less than I thought. Only maybe 25% of people, I think, raised their hands. I thought it would be a lot more. Anyway, pardon me, John, but environmentalists versus ranchers is what I'm forced to come up with because I don't know of another name for either one here. Environmentalists have argued that ranching must be managed with resource protection being the first and foremost command of the Park Service. And ranching must be consistent with that to the extent it's allowed at all. The ranchers have argued that it was Congress's intent that these lands would always be managed as basically private ranch lands like they had been before, not public lands, public park lands. So who's right? To begin with, John mentioned the Park Service Organic Act, which was passed in 1916. I'm going to have to read. I have 4 laws that I have to read because I want you to see what the words are so that you can interpret them yourself and understand what they say. The first one is, as I said, the 1916 Organic Act. It created the Park Service, and it says as follows. The Secretary shall regulate the use of the National Park System by means and measures that conform to the fundamental purpose of system units, which purpose is to conserve the scenery and natural and historic objects and wildlife in such manner as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. I may have skipped a few words there. Anyway, that's the first of the 2 laws. The first part is to conserve the scenery and natural and historic objects and wildlife. The next law that environmentalists point to is an amendment to the Seashore Act passed in 1976. And again, I'm going to have to read it. It says that the seashore shall be administered without impairment of its natural values in a manner which provides for such recreational, educational, historic preservation, interpretation, and scientific research opportunities as are consistent with, based upon, and supportive of maximum protection, restoration, and preservation of the natural environment. Now, what laws can the ranchers point to that Congress intended that ranching must be permanent? Okay, in 1962, Congress, of course, passed the act, and one of the provisions in it was no parcel of more than 500 acres could be acquired without the consent of the owner, so long as it is used exclusively for ranching and dairying purposes.
Jim, is that the right slide, sir?
Thanks. It's hard for me to see what slides up there. I got a 78 amendment.
You're 2 slides ahead.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
You have the exam?
What's that?
Sorry, go ahead, Jim, I'm being wise guy.
Okay, maybe I'm repeating myself, but in 1962, when the act was passed, there was a provision put in that no parcel of more than 500 acres.
It's 2 slides back.
It's
What is
back.
going on here?
You're ahead of the slides, Jim.
back.
Can you go backwards?
There
you are.
Oh, okay, thanks. Anyway, it says no parcel of more than 500 acres shall be acquired without the consent of the owner, so long as it is used exclusively for ranching and dairying purposes. Now, what does this say and mean? This provision was put in into the bill after the bill wasn't moving anywhere in committee for about 3 years. The committee chairman, Wayne Aspinall, was requiring Clem Miller, the congressman who was pushing the bill, to get local support before he would move the bill forward. So the Park Service came up with an amendment to insert in the bill that said that we give up our power to condemn lands. So in other words, the Park Service, the ranchers, the Park Service can't condemn any of the lands the ranchers have as long as they keep ranching and don't sell to a subdivider. And that resolved the impasse that had prevented the bill from moving forward. Okay. Now, in 1978, another amendment occurred, and this one provided that, as you'll see, that the secretary could lease land for ranching at Point Reyes, but only where appropriate in the discretion of the secretary and subject to such restrictive covenants as may be necessary. So today, ranching is allowable, but it's not required. Congress left it to the secretary's discretion. However, the 1916 Park Service Organic Act and the 1976 Amendment to the Seashore Act greatly limit that discretion. And this is the only expression of congressional intent as to ranching under Park Service ownership. So has the Park Service been following the mandates in the 2 laws? We'll take a look at that. Here you see a part of the seashore, nice rolling hills, lots of nice green grass. It's green in the rainy season and it's brown and dead in the non-rainy season. The original coastal prairie of perennial bunch grasses, forbs, and brush have been converted or has been converted by ranching into a monoculture of non-native annual European grasses, far less beneficial to wildlife for food and cover and soil stability. You'll notice those 2 black slides there. That wouldn't have happened if there had been bunch grass as it originally existed there, because bunch grass has roots that go down 6 feet into the ground. It's very fibrous, and the grass you see out there has roots that only go 2 to 6 inches down. Also, it doesn't provide any cover or food for any wildlife except elk. Elk eat grass just like cows do. Deer are less likely to, but they still do. They're browsers, whereas elk are grazers like cows. But just picture something out there like that's vulnerable, like a brush rabbit in the middle of that grass. Any red-tailed hawk or any coyote or whatever going around there is going to spot that rabbit and grab it. So it's not good for rabbits. Okay, so soils. Cows have caused a lot of damage to the soils out there. Cows range in weight from 14 to 1,700 pounds. And when it rains, the soil is less able to absorb water if it gets compacted. So the water quickly runs off the land. And cow trails, as you see in this photo, are the worst example of compacting. When the water runs off the land, it takes topsoil and manure with it into the nearest creek. Here's a milk cow, dairy cow in one of the waters of the park. As you can see, it's taking a poop right now. In 2023, it was calculated that ranching deposited over 79,000 tons of manure on the park land. That's equal to the weight of 790,000 men, or more than 2 US Hornet aircraft carriers. Here's an example of impaired water quality. This is Keogh Lagoon, which is a very polluted place. There are 3 kinds of parameters for water pollution: pathogens, nutrients, and sediments. As you can see, there's an awful lot of algae there, and that's because of nutrients in manure, nitrogen and phosphorus. The lagoon was also tested for water quality several times, and the most recent test done by a private third party found that the lagoon was 21 times the standard for E. coli, which is a very nasty pathogen that you don't want to take in or you'll wind up getting sick. Oh, okay. Okay. 15 minutes already, what?
Getting close.
Huh? Okay. All right. This is a photo of one of the elk that died in the last 2 droughts in the elk reserve. 478 elk starved to death in the penned area. A lawsuit was filed and the Park Service decided to remove the fence. Here's another example of the Park Service favoring ranching over wildlife. In the 2021 GMP, when the Drake's elk herd would exceed a certain level, elk were to be shot instead of reducing cattle numbers. This is in a unit of the National Park System. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Eric Mulbar, please.
Wait for the slides here. My name is Eric Mulvar. I'm the Executive Director of Western Watersheds Project, and I am a professional ecologist with studies on ecosystem effects of herbivory on Alaskan treeline ecosystems. But I've also done a lot of research into what happens all across the West, because Western Watersheds Project specializes in the reform of the livestock industry and how to get back to healthy native ecosystems. And Point Reyes National Seashore is a public land that, as pointed out by one of our earlier speakers, has some really important California coastal prairies that are very important for biodiversity. And I would argue that the biodiversity crisis is one of 2 major crises that we are facing right now that we as humans must come to grips with. It's not just the climate crisis. The biodiversity crisis is every bit as important. And Point Reyes is known for a variety of different outstanding natural values, including the shorebirds, including the very rare snowy plover. We have the marine mammals that breed here. We have the magnificent Thule elk, which are the subject of a great deal of discussion and controversy today. And we have other species of wildlife. And these are lands that were designated by Congress essentially for Point Reyes National Seashore, established for purposes of public recreation, benefit, and inspiration, for Golden Gate National Recreation Area, established to preserve public use and enjoyment. So if you look at the statutory requirements that were set forth by Congress, you see a lot of public benefit, public enjoyment, public values. You don't see a lot of private use and enjoyment. in this. And so you also don't see any mention of livestock in the purposes of these national seashores. So anyway, these were intended to be lands that were managed primarily for preservation, primarily for healthy natural landscapes. It's all very idyllic. But there were problems. And sometimes there were more than 6,000 cattle that were being run on commercial operations in Point Reyes National Seashore. And those cattle had impacts. The dairy operations liquefied manure from their operations and spread them all over the hilltops on the national seashore. This is unprecedented anywhere else in the national park system. There were manure avalanches that were so severe that at one point Representative Huffman suggested that the elephant seals should be moved from their natural breeding and brood rearing sites on the seashore to make way, because there were these toxic and environmentally destructive manure avalanches that were coming down onto the seashore. There were violations of the Clean Water Act, sometimes 30 times the legal limit of different species of bacteria. These had major effects on the ability of the public to safely use and enjoy the seashore areas. These water pollution plumes were going down into the lagoons where children were playing on the beach, causing a serious health safety hazard. And of course, there was the Tule elk situation, where we had the majority of Tule elk on Point Reyes National Seashore penned up on a relatively small peninsula that during drought years turned waterless. And then when these droughts occurred, the elk would die by the hundreds. And this is a photograph of an elk that died trying to get a drink in a pond that had dried up. And these elk were prevented from naturally dispersing to other parts of the national seashore where they could find forage, where they could find water, by this fence that was erected primarily to defend the ranchers from having to deal with competition for forage with the Tule elk, which are native to this area. And of course, there were the impacts of the livestock grazing itself. And here you see a dairy operation in Point Reyes National Seashore where the cattle have grazed the land down to bare dirt. And this rivals the overgrazing, the worst overgrazing that I have seen all across the Western United States. I've been to Nevada, I've been to Wyoming, I've been to Colorado. The Bureau of Land Management allows and permits overgrazing everywhere and authorizes it. This rivals the worst overgrazing that I've seen on those Bureau of Land Management lands. And in the wake of that kind of overgrazing, what comes back is invasive species of weeds. What you're looking at here, these kind of these clumps that look like almost like a cancer on the land, are milk thistle. That's a non-native invasive species, but the grasses in between them also are invasive species. Things like Italian ryegrass, European annual grasses that grow shallow-rooted for a short period in the springtime, brown off in the summer, and die entirely, giving up all their carbon back to the atmosphere. This is not sustainable from an environmental standpoint. This has converted the area of Point Reyes National Seashore that was dedicated into the so-called pastoral zone into basically 100% invasive weeds. The California coastal grasslands were entirely destroyed and displaced. So my organization and two others filed suit back in 2016. And when I came in with Western Watersheds Project, one of my first tasks when I came in the door was there were settlement talks over the first lawsuit that we brought. And we brought a lawsuit that said that the Park Service had failed to create a new general management plan in a timely fashion, which was true. They had issued livestock leases without creating any environmental review or looking at the environmental impacts. They had livestock grazing that fundamentally violated the Park Service Organic Act and the Point Reyes Act, in addition to federal regulations. This is what we alleged in our first lawsuit. And we signed a settlement. And the settlement basically said the Park Service must create a general management plan, and they must consider at least one alternative where they end commercial livestock grazing on Point Reyes National Seashore. This came to be known as Alternative F. And when the National Park Service went through its general management plan process, they asked for public comment, and 6,900 odd people commented on the Point Reyes National Seashore plan. 91.4% of the public comments opposed further ranching on Point Reyes National Seashore. And of those comments which specified which alternative they preferred for their park, 94.2% of them recommended that the Park Service adopt alternative F, the alternative that would end livestock grazing forever on Point Reyes National Seashore. So that was what the public wanted. Then, of course, in 2021, the Harvard Animal Law Clinic filed a lawsuit challenging the elk fence and the confinement of Thule elk on Point Reyes, on Tomales Point, on the basis that they had failed to revise their management plan, on the basis that they had failed to revise their elk management plan, and the failure to provide adequate water and forage. That lawsuit was unsuccessful at the district court level, but was under appeal during the time when all of the other activities that we're going to be talking about today have taken place. And then my organization, together with the Resource Renewal Institute, Center for Biological Diversity, and represented by Advocates for the West, filed another lawsuit against the new general management plan because the Park Service had doubled down on ranching, not only offering 20-year leases for further livestock everywhere where there was livestock grazing on the park, but also expanding the number of allowable uses. So we filed suit and we argued that authorizing this livestock grazing violates the fundamental statutes for which these parks were authorized, that the Park Service failed to take a hard look at the impacts of the various ranching activities on the Thule elk, and that the new general management plan authorized levels of livestock grazing that were violating the Clean Water Act. And then during the course of this process, as the litigation proceeded, the California Coastal Commission had a process of its own, and it basically decided that the ranching operations on Point Reyes National Seashore would indeed be subject to the water quality standards that the state manages for. That put a lot of pressure on the livestock operations that up to this point had been violating those Clean Water Act standards. And so ultimately in 2024, in December of last year, the Park Service decided in a separate decision to take down the Thule elk fence. That took care of the Thule elk issues in some respects. And then in January of this year, my organization and the ranchers and the National Park Service, together with the Nature Conservancy, which was brought in because they had money for buyouts for certain members of the ranching community, we all signed an agreement saying we're going to end this litigation with a settlement. And the ranchers got a pretty good deal. The ranchers that stayed got 20-year leases and they got expanded uses. So they are better off today than they were before the lawsuit. The ranchers that took the buyouts got multi-million-dollar payouts pooled amongst them. I don't know how much any of these ranchers got individually. My organization has a wing called the Sagebrush Fund that does buy out ranchers. Just doing some basic math, these seem like really generous amounts of money that these ranchers are getting, probably more than the Sagebrush Fund would authorize. The environmental groups get to dismiss our lawsuit with prejudice, which means that we don't get to bring those claims against this decision once again. We forswear the option to litigate against this particular general management plan. On the other hand, if there are amendments to this general management plan or further actions, we remain free to litigate those. Then we are able to litigate future leases that are issued. And then at the same time, the Park Service put out a new general management plan, which is radically different than their 2021 version. And in that general management plan, 12 of the 14 ranches will retire, take buyouts, and leave the National Seashore. Dairying ends forever on Point Reyes National Seashore. The departing ranches are converted to a scenic landscape zone, and that scenic landscape zone has an allowable targeted grazing that can occur under the Nature Conservancy or somebody else that's in the nonprofit sector, but it can't be commercial grazing. And Grayton Rancheria can get some influence over what happens next, including potentially tribal burning. On the left, you see the number of ranches that were active. The dairies are in light tan. The dark tan is beef ranches before the litigation and before the settlement. To the right, you see those purple areas are the scenic landscape zone. After those ranches will depart. So now you see that most of Point Reyes National Seashore will be managed for scenic landscape. Most of Golden Gate National Recreation Area will continue to be allowable for commercial livestock grazing. Now the Thule elk actually get primacy over cattle on Point Reyes National Seashore. They're the first consideration. And what we want to see is we want to see a return to the natural order of things, where it's the Thule elk and the tribal burning that maintain the coastal grasslands. And we want to see the restoration of those coastal grasslands everywhere throughout the National Seashore, such that not only do we have these tiny little pockets of surviving native ecosystems, but we have healthy native ecosystems restored throughout the entire park. Thank you.
You're up.
All right, well, this is a little off the cuff for me, so bear with me a little bit. My name is Stephanie Marita Arend. I am fifth generation dairy farmer. My mom and dad are here today, Derek, Deborah, and Don Marita. Thank you, mom and dad, for coming. I hope my goal here is to provide an alternative perspective and just to kind of share our community's beliefs and opinions on the subject matter. So first and foremost, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. And I want to just open with a recent article from February 8th, written by John Beck of the Press Democrat. The party that more than any other symbolized the fundraising machine that would help a giant conservation group and its wealthy donors shape a new era at Point Reyes National Seashore took place at a $20 million 7-bedroom estate in Ross, not far from the Lagunitas Country Club. It was a kind of a soiree where valet parking was offered inside the gate and millions of dollars were on the table as Bay Area philanthropists gathered for a quote unquote, an intimate conversation about the future of Point Reyes. The farmers didn't have a chance in the regard that the money on the table far exceeded what we had access to. Coupled with a non-disclosure agreement that they could not reach out to the community, it was impossible to gather the public and have an open and honest conversation. If you are moving forward with integrity and honesty, you don't silence those in the conversation. You draw people in and gather the public's opinion. That is not what happened. When we hear about the people in the public commenting on this situation, the people that were actually brought in were from outside of our area, all across the United States. And in fact, Sonoma Marin residents were unaware, which is why today we're all sitting here in this room asking the question of how did this happen and why did it happen? So, as you know, the farmers were under some sort of non-disclosure agreement and have guardrails on what they can and more importantly cannot say. Due to this NDA, the public and agriculture community were unaware of this assault. I can confidently say that if we, the farming community and vast majority of the public were aware, we all would have stepped in to support the farms and provide resistance to these organizations' elitist attempts. This was demonstrated during the failed attempt to rid Sonoma County of farms last November with Measure J. The public is waking up and taking recognition that the deep pockets that are coming after our beloved community. This is a huge loss for our farmers and that are the one that the family legacy ended with. You cannot begin to comprehend the weight of that. In farming and agriculture, people often ask like, oh, you know, they can just close their doors and move on. But the weight that happens, and as a future generation farmer to my family, being the person that your great-grandparents literally sacrificed everything for, and then my papa and my nanny sacrificed everything for. My papa was born in one house, he died in the other at 86 years old with his paperwork next to him. He literally died working. My mom and dad, I see them struggle. I won't get too emotional over it, but I see them struggle. I see them sacrifice every day for our family and their grandkids. I don't want to be that person to lose and to be the one who the family, the failure of the family. I can't imagine what these farmers are feeling, and that's why they did not want to come up here today. That's why it's hard to get them to come out and speak aside from the non-disclosure agreement. But we're sidestepping something super important here, okay? It is a loss for the farmers and them being able to move forward, but you as a community, you are losing something much greater. You are losing a local food source on a soon-to-be already constrained food system.
Amen.
I hope you all know how to hunt elk. Because pretty soon when you need some meat, you might have to go
Yeah.
get it on your own.
Yeah.
I think it is inherently the motivation of why these farmers were condemned and shut down in what they were, because when you go to a farmer and you say, I would like to buy your land, I don't care what dollar amount you offer today, you can offer 3 times the market value. They don't want to do it because that dollar amount doesn't begin to touch what it's going to give to their future generations. You've not heard the term rich farmer. That's not a thing, right? Cash poor, land rich. That's because our grandparents and our grandparents and so on sacrificed so much so that we could continue on. That's what we're talking about here. So when you have a group of people who have a lot of money and you won't answer to their call to sell, what do they have left to do? They have the option to go to you and say, you know what? We're not going to have this conversation anymore. Here's a lawsuit.
Yeah.
And through vexatious litigation, we eventually are forced out. Starting in 1962, the Point Reyes Act was enacted by JFK. Within that, he gave the Secretary of Interior the ability to appraise, purchase, and secure land in order to create what we know today as the Point Reyes National Seashore, for both the benefit of the public and the conservation of the land. Both in 2016 and 2022, lawsuits include excerpts from this act in order to creatively depict the image that the Point Reyes Seashore was solely created for the benefit of recreation. However, there's a very important section within the act under section 4 where it states that the landowner, that any landowner that have over 500 acres and is solely used for the purpose of farming and ranching cannot be acquired without the owner's consent. This shows that farmers with less than 500 acres were absorbed via eminent domain, aka by force, and others were pressured for years and eventually bought out with the promise of being able to farm in perpetuity. Due to these lawsuits, these promises have conveniently been broken via an indirect force through the actions of these nonprofit organizations. Within the lawsuits themselves, they make of various claims, things that the farms and ranches are creating a detriment to the environment. In my humble opinion, I think these facade and ridiculous claims are easy to stipend with a little common sense and visual awareness. If you drive out to Point Reyes, there is literally a road, and on one side you have the national park. On the other side, you have a farm. This side is covered in brush. Wildfire is an issue for us today. We're all very concerned here in California. It is overgrown and it does not look healthy. On this side, it looks healthy. If you think about the sampling and the scientific information that you have just seen, I want to point you in a direction that you can look on your own about the Channel Islands. Tim Setnick is an important individual that happened with those who, after the Channel Islands were taken over from cattle farming, he came out as a whistleblower and basically said that the samples taken on that island were fabricated, and that he knew that the people going out and creating these samples were taking them from areas that were not legitimately showing what the soil health and water health were. I have spoken to 2 farmers out there. They have their own set of water samples and they are not showing this information. More importantly, we have the State Water Board. The State Water Board regulates anytime after a 24-hour major rainfall, we are required to go out and sample waterways to see if there's discharge. If you go to the State Water Board resource, you will see that these farms and ranches do not have any non-compliance issues. So why do we have this happening today? If you go onto the National Park Service website and you look back at their 1900 pictures, you'll see that those pictures look very similar, if not identical, to what you can see today. That does not tell me that the farms and ranchers there are degrading the land. It tells me that they are, in fact, by the very definition, conserving the land. If it looks the same as it did over 100 years ago, It is in fact conservation, is it not? Why pick on small family farms? The answer is so simple, money. When you take a farmer that has been doing business for generations, and then you go, I already went that point, I'm sorry, jumping around.
You brave girl, don't worry about it.
Oh, thank you. I'd like to point out that as you force us out, you burn the brush, you get the critters to run out, so you can attack them white knuckled and bared. That's what's happening with these farmers. Organizations like the Resource Renewal Institute, Center for Biological Diversity, Western Watersheds Project, Californians for Alternatives to Toxins, California Sports Fisheries, and the California River Watch, among others, strategically and methodically sue farmers for their benefit or the benefit of their donors. I can tell you, I have seen many lawsuits now where I see these organizations strategically suing these farms with the same cookie cutter language under the Clean Water Act, asserting that these farms are doing damage and harm. And when you reach towards these small family farms who don't have deep pockets and you tie them up in litigation, they eventually have to settle out. Because that's the cheapest way and that's the way that you can get out with survival. It is known that a series of wealthy elites have started this. This is not the motivation of environmentalists. We like environmentalists. We work cohesively and in a symbiotic relationship with environmentalists because it is illogical to think that farms don't support the environment and the environment doesn't support farms. When we look at a pasture land for our animals or for crops, if you grow tomatoes in your garden, you know you need quality soil. You have to have quality water. If the water is toxic, we will have unhealthy animals. Also, our families live on the ranches. So that means we are pulling water from the same well. Why would we have toxic water to feed our children? Why would we have bare lands? The photos you saw, those are holding pens in the wintertime. Those are not grazing pastures. That is a snippet, a very well edited, cropped out photo to be able to show you and to publicize. If we have healthy soils, we get good grass, we get healthy animals. We don't want to spend money on having to take care of a sick animal. I can take $1,000 and I can put it into an animal and I can get out good meat. Or I can take $1,000 and put it into an animal and get a sick animal that we're going to have to condemn. Which one makes more sense? It's just simply not logical. Okay. Sorry,
1 minute.
1 minute. All right. I'll leave you with this. There are different options than filing lawsuits, and I've had this conversation with other organizations directly. You can simply, believe it or not, go to a farmer and say, hey, I have a concern and I'd like to talk to you about it. I'm with this organization and we want to have an open-ended conversation. This happened with Kevin Lunny at the Nature Conservancy. And what that Nature Conservancy gentleman found is he was at Kevin's kitchen table with his wife having a conversation about the settlement agreement. We are old school, we work that way. The second option is that you can in fact go to one of the regulatory bodies and submit the same exact complaint, and they will force something to be cured and fixed. The difference is that if these organizations went that direction, guess what they don't get?
Money.
Pockets don't get lined, but there are fixes that get put into place. And these organizations such as the EPA and the Water Board have full authority to shut down organizations or farms if they are not meeting the standards. But instead, these organizations choose to go the latter and they choose to file suits and take the money and shut down farms. This is what your food system is up against. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jack Gescheit.
Got that clock yet? Can I stand here or am I out of your camera if I do this?
Just so I can look at slides. If it's really a pain, I'll stand here, but.
I can move it to.
How's that?
Like the buttons laser.
Hi there, I'm Jack Gescheit, environmental activist. Oh God, please, 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 please introduce me to those wealthy elites. Send them my way. So I'm a forest advocate. I love trees and that's my advocacy point. So how did I end up here? Talking about Point Reyes. So the name of this little doodad here in 10 minutes is the shame of Point Reyes and the inconvenient truth of the 21st century. The thing we do not want to talk about. So guess which one I am? And that is my grandmother, the only grandmother I knew, my mother's mother, who was an immigrant from, as it was called then, the Ukraine. Like you, emotional about family, huh? So she came to this country in 1916 to escape the Tsar, a seamstress, worked her fingers so her hands were all curled up like mine are getting, although I don't work as hard as she did. We were in nature together. My only memories of this woman was doing things like this in nature and her just being a loving presence as grandmothers are. I have spent my time in nature. This is a year later. We're flashing forward to age 3. I love being outdoors, as I'm sure the one thing, perhaps two things that unites this whole group here is loving this beautiful place, Marin County. Whether that's on a farm, I completely take you at your word about ranching and being connected to the land and feeling that. Same with hunters. I'm not a hunter, but I understand it. I really do. But I'm just speaking for myself. I'm an environmentalist because I love being in nature. I love being outside in these trees. I came here from New York, went to Point Reyes Seashore when I moved from New York to San Francisco, and then to Marin County. And that's how I got involved in the Point Reyes Seashore issue. So flash forward another couple of years, and that's me in the elk reserve, falling in love with these guys. And it's because of a documentary I saw, and then I became involved, one of the lead activists, to specifically for Point Reyes National Seashore, to get the ranches out of the seashore. And Jim Cota did a wonderful job explaining why that's public land now, completely different as I see it. I mean, I'm going to touch on both, and I'm going to stir up some emotions here, but completely different from whether you're going to have small family farms that are trying to struggle and survive and being consolidated by big ones, or whether they're going to be in the park. That is two, for me, different issues. And I'm a professional photographer. I spent time with these guys. There's a Tuli Oak docent here who brought me out to these. Sorry, it's the effect of being in front of people. It just heightens everything. So I love these animals. Perhaps as ranchers love their cows. I really don't doubt that. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I don't doubt it. So I love being in nature with these animals. That's the gift perhaps all of us agree on, right? That they are still and present. And that's the gift they give us humans. So that's why I go to Point Reyes, to be with the elk, to be with the other animals, bobcat, coyotes, the occasional bear even that wanders through. I don't go to see cows, which I can see elsewhere. And now I'm making a leap forward to a film I saw in 2014 called Cowspiracy, where I heard something that it couldn't be true, it made no sense. And that was globally, not just here locally, but globally, the #1 reason we cut down trees and forests is to raise cattle for human consumption, to create pasture land. And that's not the politics in this room. This is the overview, which I'm expanding to. But I had no idea. In fact, I didn't believe that. I said, BS, it can't be. I stood up like this in front of rooms, got over my fear of public speaking, and talked about, trees are precious. We can't cut down trees and forests. And I had no idea that it was because, again, globally, especially in the Amazon, the lungs of the planet, we were cutting down these old, highly functional, carbon sequestering, oxygen producing, water cleaning forests for the planet. to raise cattle for human consumption. Whatever you think of that practice, I had no idea that that was the ecology. And now I'm going to flash forward another 2019. I saw another documentary film. I'm a documentary film fan called The Shame of Point Reyes. And this is a screenshot from there. So it doesn't matter what the name of this ranch is, but it is at Point Reyes. And I'm going to come back to this picture because I guarantee you there are people in this room that see this very differently from me. And many on fine people, God help me, on both sides. So is this a healthy working landscape being restricted from fire danger by cattle grazing? Or is it a landscape that isn't like coastal prairie? So I'm going to go here. I made this photograph on the fence line at Pierce Point Road, looking west to the ocean, right on the fence, which is right in that post in the center there, in case you can't tell. And elk live on the right side, cows are on the left side. I kind of want to name that dairy, but it doesn't matter. It's right up against the fence. And there are just maybe he had at most 800 cows on, I don't know, Jim, you would know the number of acres of that ranch land. Again, I don't want to name the name. It's not personal. It's not ad hominem, but that's what cattle do to the land. And this is the best of the best, right? This is an organic dairy. I came to Point Reyes like everybody did, saying, oh, look, there's cows here. And it's 2007 or 2006 Dairy of the Year. How wonderful. And there's elk here. And I can go to the woods and I can go to the beach. What an amazing place. And that god darn film, The Shame of Point Reyes, ruined that for me. See if I can, if it'll play. There's a little video here. And if it doesn't play, as it isn't playing, I will just skip to, oh, maybe it will play. So I do not agree that photos are doctored. Let's see if this, well, it's not going to play. There's a video there and it sweeps. I mean, this is another ranch. Again, I don't want to name names. It doesn't matter. But look at this.
It was just on the
But you just
side.
did.
Oops.
Oh.
Oops. Sorry, it really wasn't. Okay, so anyway, Bob and I have met and shook hands. We did a demonstration on his place. Again, it's not him. And if it's up to me, I would help hardworking families transition out of this business, at least at Point Reyes Seashore for sure. Look at this land, look at this land, look at this land. It is, again, another shot. There's no sign in this one, but again, it doesn't matter. I'm asking people to see this with fresh eyes as opposed to, oh, well, this is what happens at this time of year. In March right now, this looks wonderfully green. That's what I was taught when I came here from New York. Right? Oh, rolling green hills, it looks like Ireland. And it was only in this issue, in this film, that I learned that's not the native landscape. It's coyote brush that's this tall or taller, and there's wildlife in there hiding and living. And when you do this with a farm to raise food, beef and dairy, which I love, I don't eat it anymore. I choose not to. I can't control anybody about that. I choose to eat other products, right? Controversial, God forbid. It's not that I don't like the taste. It's not that I would forbid anybody from eating it. It doesn't work that way. It's inform people and let them make their own choices. But this is what it does to the land. And this certainly shouldn't happen at Point Reyes National Seashore. Huge amount of manure. Eric touched on that. And inevitably, of course, with manure spreading as well, we're overlapping here, Eric, but with rains, it goes into the waterways. And do not take my word for it. I'm the lead activist whose idea was to say, well, let's test the freaking water. And then well, I wish we had wealthy elites again contributing to this. We got an independent civil engineer who found those numbers in the corner there. Fecal coliform, 23 times the health limits. E. coli, 10 times. Enterococci, 30 times. And there were overages higher than that. And that's not, if you want to defend all ranching, fine. Not in Point Reyes National Seashore, not when you find those numbers. It's why the Park Service stopped testing water in 2013, because they were finding this stuff and it was bad politically. So it was the Trumpian, don't mention that word, the Trumpian solution. I know how to get the number of COVID diseases, what to call it, COVID. Cases, thank you. I know, let's not test. Problem solved, no more cases. So that's what went on at the Park Service. So we started it up again, did 2 years, the second year incredibly thorough, and we found these overages. Now here's the more general attack. 800 gallons of water, roughly, I've seen estimates as low as 500 and up to 1,000 to produce a gallon of milk. If you want to do that, that's not a big problem in Michigan or Vermont. Well, I went to an organic dairy farm in Vermont when I was a child, and we drank it right out of the cooling tank out of the cow. Not homogenized, not pasteurized. I was afraid to drink it. That's how removed I was from the food source. It was delicious and creamy and wonderful. But That is in California. There's a water shortage. So on the left here, 47% of the state's water goes to producing meat and dairy. So we're told, replace the lawns, right? Don't, a shorter shower, be careful with your water. Well, sure, that's good. You should do that. But that is dwarfed by the amount of water that goes into making dairy and beef. And then, of course, the real one people don't want to talk about, on the Al Gore of 2025, methane, methane, methane. And this picture is wrong, this silly little drawing out of the back of the cow. It's mostly actually from the front of the cow, but it doesn't matter. It's enteric digestion from cows produces a lot of methane. It's just simple. If you don't want to believe in climate science, fine. You don't want to believe in global warming or methane emissions, fine. But this is the reality. And of course, these days, I'm reading Orwell's 1984 right now, which is chilling. You just deny it. Deny anything. Deny science, come up with your own studies. That's where we're going in this society, and it scares the pants off me. And then, of course, 4% of wild animals, I have about a minute left?
Yeah.
Okay. 4% of wild animals are left on Earth. This is not about Point Reyes, it's not about farming per se, but what we humans are doing with our management techniques is killing the wild animals and replacing them. Now, this is a cut on the dairy and beef business, replacing them with the large bovines we love to eat. And back to the film, so it's deforestation, climate crisis, fecal waste, and huge water use. Not appropriate, certainly we can agree, in Point Reyes National Seashore. That landscape for me has no wildlife on it. You want to do that on your private property? That is another discussion for another day. Point Reyes Seashore is why I'm here. I'm touching on the other, but this is a microcosm of what's going on in the world. For these guys, which were actually here way before the ranchers, before Native Americans, for hundreds of thousands of years, these animals were here in huge numbers in the land. They should be returned there, allowed to flourish. I don't even want to go here right now. I'm going to do it quick. So putting a cow into a pen like that separately away from the mom, I wouldn't call that humane. It's a whole nother discussion. I'll stick with the three I've already stirred up, which is the shame of Point Reyes and the inconvenient truth of the effect of cattle ranching in the 21st century. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all our speakers. That was a pretty amazing discussion. We have some time for questions.
Not a one.
Yes, sir.
So in one of the slides showed that there was a regulation about 500 acres. Is that still the law, or has that been repealed?
Repealed.
I'm
Been
fine.
repealed?
Repealed in 1970.
Okay.
In the 1962 Point Reyes Act, what that's referencing is how the land should be acquired. And what it states there is that land over 500 acres had to be at the consent of a farmer or rancher. And anybody that also had private land of over 500 acres could stay so long as the land remained unadulterated or farmed or ranched. That was just how the land should be acquired.
But is that still the law?
No, it's all been applied. It was repealed.
That's my question.
But it only prevented the government from condemning somebody's ranch. So if someone sold and all the ranchers did, it didn't have any effect or relevance.
Right, thank you.
And fundamentally, it's my understanding of the history that all of the ranches on the National Seashore and Golden Gate National Recreation Area sold to the federal government. Those properties became property of the National Park Service. They were no longer private property. They were then leased back on the voluntary basis by the National Park Service, but there was no law requiring them to do that.
I can add something about the attitudes of the time. The pioneers, the founders of Point Reyes, did not have any great interest in agriculture. They appreciated the fact that it had helped keep the land open. They said, thank you, now it's ours. The love affair of Marin County and its agriculture came in about 10 or 15 years later and affected the park as well.
Thank you, John.
Thank you to the speakers and to the coalition for organizing this today. I came here not to cast a vote on who was right or wrong on this decades-long dilemma. I came here to hopefully understand more, to educate myself on what has been going on, so that I could balance out my understanding with all the various reports I'm reading and hearing. So in an attempt to be as apolitical as possible, I'd like to offer what hopefully is some constructive criticism to the organizers. And that is to not have such an unbalanced panel
Yes.
if your intentions
For real.
are to have discussions that matter. My understanding is, and again, I'm not taking sides at all, I'm trying to be constructive here. My understanding is our last speaker, Stephanie, actually invited her, asked if she could join this panel. And I have no idea what this afternoon would have been like if she was not here. I'm disappointed that while I learned tidbits from each of the presenters, I did not really gain anything in terms of the knowledge I was hoping to acquire.
Yeah, let me speak to that for just 1 second. When we were trying to arrange a discussion on this particular topic, which is a difficult one, we looked far and wide for people in the dairy ranching business. And I think largely due to the legal restrictions that the farmers and the dairy farmers and the ranchers were under, we couldn't find people who would be willing to participate or who felt they were able to participate legally. Now, we can all question that, but that was our experience. We're grateful very much that we had a person who would stand up and say, no, I'm a dairy farmer and I'm happy to participate. It happened at the last moment. And we wish that we could have found more people who are willing to speak. So let me just leave it at that.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys doing that, and especially because there are much more educated and well-spoken people. I did actually have Anya Radabal, who is the executive director of Western United, and is actually their organization is helping to rehome all of the farmers that are affected by this point raise action, because in the settlement agreement, the 120 workers have to move as well. And so part of that agreement is that our organization that we farmers pay for are the ones who are actually rehoming all of our workers. And she was able to come, but the panel was too large.
Thank you.
And I think it's also important to note that in this conundrum of, is there a non-disclosure agreement that muzzles the ranchers? I myself am under exactly the same mediation confidentiality requirement as the ranchers who signed that agreement, as the National Park Service, and the Nature Conservancy has a little bit more freedom of speech. But this is not a unilateral restriction that applies to the ranchers. This applies to every party in the negotiation. And it was something that wasn't imposed on the ranchers by the environmentalists or by the Park Service. It was a measure that the mediator put into place so that the mediator put into place as a standard practice, because if you do not have confidentiality in settlement discussions, that puts a chill on those settlement discussions, because people are so worried about what they might say in the confidentiality of mediation going public that they will not speak, and then you can't get to a settlement. So if you want to have negotiations, one of the first things that you do is you say, okay, what happens in the room stays in the room, but you can still talk about every other issue.
Thank you, Eric. Next.
Hi, so the discussion, excuse me, the discussion that we're having is a discussion about rewilding and domestic animals, cows versus wild animals, elk. The National Park Service has relocated elk on Point Reyes by helicopter and has delivered contraception to elk by helicopter. So this is a highly, there are great pictures of elk being in the Press Democrat of elk being captured by helicopter to have their contraception injected. So looking at the future of Point Reyes, if we say that we're removing managed domesticated animals and replacing them with wild animals, I would be curious to hear your definition of what conditions have to exist for an animal to be wild, particularly in a place where there are no natural predators for elk. And if elk in the future at Point Reyes becomes sick, where there's a serious drought and a die-off, do you think the elk should be permitted to die? Do you think that population should be managed? Do you think park visitors should be allowed to watch elk dying because they're wild animals? Thank you.
There's a mic, it doesn't work. No. Oh, was that a panelist answer or not?
Oh, I'll go ahead and address that then.
Oh, because you have a mic that works, buddy, huh?
You're gonna get his own mic pretty quick.
So at any rate, I agree with you that there's something a little unnatural about putting birth control as a method of population control on Point Reyes National Seashore. And of course, that I think is largely an artifact of having a population that was pinned onto a very small peninsula without the freedom to roam. Now that the elk fence is coming down, now that those elk can distribute themselves and disperse themselves across the National Seashore, they are going to have access to far more forage, far more water than they did before. The elk are going to be able to expand their numbers. The number of cattle on Point Reyes National Seashore at its peak was over 6,000. If you have an equivalent number of elk eating the same forage, that's enough for 12,000 elk. Right now, we have maybe a maximum of 500 elk anywhere on the seashore. So we're a long way from any kind of difficulty. Now, the settlement wasn't a perfect solution when it comes to ultimate elk problems, because what it did is it said the elk will have freedom to roam on Point Reyes National Seashore only, but they can't go on to Golden Gate National Recreation Area, and they can't go out into the surrounding landscape. Tule elk are native to all of these lands throughout Northern California. If we were managing this as a natural system, we wouldn't be trying to frustrate a native species in their ability to use the landscape and re-inhabit their natural landscape. I think that letting the Tule elk access areas throughout their range would put them on a par with every other elk subspecies in the West that does overlap with agriculture and does get to access private lands in public in an unrestricted way. I think that's the future, but it's not yet.
Could you address the gentleman's question about predation and the lack thereof?
I think that that there probably is. There are fewer predators today on Point Reyes National Seashore. Tule elk are small. There are coyotes. Coyotes can be an elk predator, particularly on the calves. There are mountain lions that are starting to show up in parts of this region. Those are elk predators. There are wolves that are expanding their range in California. At some point, I hope that there will be wolves that colonize Point Reyes National Seashore. There were an animal that's on the California state flag on Point Reyes National Seashore, the grizzly bear. Someday, maybe. But you can't have everything all at once. So let's take it one step at a time.
Okay, thank you. Just 1 second.
Hello. One thing that I noticed about this panel through the discussion is the lack of indigenous peoples part of this, and also the very whiteness of the panel, if I'm being very transparent, and the gender discrepancy of just a lack of fullness of having more balance in that. So just to bring that to people's awareness, it would just be nice to be listening to a diversity of voices on the topic. And then another question I have for you all, we're talking about, I was an environmental studies major for UCSB, so I'm very familiar with a lot of different projects we've done as humans that have a lot of negative consequences that haven't really been witnessed until we think we're doing well, and then we go forth with it, and there are a lot of consequences that we actually have to unravel from that. So I'm curious about, have you all gone through, like, what are the potential consequences of this project and possibilities for it not going the way that you had planned, and what those are? And then my second question is,
what do you think about the food system? Because we are humans and we live here. So how do you offset the amount of food production that will be being decreased? A lot of that was organic in that area, super important, dairy and meat. And like, what do you think about the impact on the food system? And has that been taken into consideration? I think that there's a wealth of information that humans can be beneficial, and working with farmers is another way of like working with people. And if I could have a third question, but probably not, I'm curious why it wasn't so public. Like, why wasn't this brought to the community? Why was it behind closed doors? And why weren't the farmers included? Even having this at 11 o'clock today is hard.
I'll take the first two questions and I'll let somebody else answer the third. The first one was about the diversity of the panel. I appreciate your question. As a lone woman up here, I think that this farming in general is predominantly male. Okay, that's just across the board. As far as the indigenous people, I don't know if there's access to anybody or how that goes, but of course, it's always good to have different persons' perspectives. Our food system. I can tell you that this is going to strain us, and it's such a huge loss on your food system because some of these farms are Strauss, some of these farms are Clover. Strauss was just recognized in France when they signed the global, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the dairy. Anyhow, he was recognized for his sustainability, regenerative practices, and they are globally, they stated that they want to model the global dairy industry after what Strauss is doing. The average size, this is on the USDA statistic, you can look it up, between 2,000 to 4,000 is our average dairy size. None of these farms were 800 cows. All of these farms were small. Some of them were 200 cows, 300 cows. The only thing smaller in the United States are Amish farms. That's on the East Coast. That's different. It's a subset. That is way off of the bell curve. These farms were tiny. I believe that food systems, whether it be crops or animal agriculture, is better to be segmented than to be consolidated into huge, concentrated Walmart-style farms. That is what is going to happen to your food system. It is going to be consolidated to the Auroras in Texas of 40,000 cow dairies, and we are going to lose the standalone farmer that walks out and sees his cows on a daily basis and has his children on the ground. It is better for soil to have segmented dairy farms. It is better for us to have organic practices of good quality food that comes from good quality soil that the elk do benefit from because of the quality that is passed around. The slurry trucks that you're seeing on these ugly pictures, I understand that it's cow manure, but let's be real. What is cow manure? It's fermented grass and fermented hay, corn, barley, almonds, organic. One farm out here in Sonoma Marin County pelletizes that and sells it back, and it is highly valuable. We have had compost companies call our farm directly, come out and sample it, and they want our manure because it is extremely valuable to pass on to people to be able to grow their own gardens. Our food system is going to be strained because of this loss, especially for those of you who really do appreciate and value local, small farms, family farms, multi-generational farms. The collective knowledge that we are also losing that's going to hurt our farming system, our food system here, is over 1,200 years. You won't get that back. It's gone.
Go ahead. Brief, please, Jack.
Yeah, you better ask for it to be brief, buddy. So I don't know where to,
Thank you.
I don't know where to begin. I mean, first of all, it's Point Reyes National Seashore. So separate from, I've never been to your farm. I don't know what goes on there, but that picture, the pictures we're showing, it's a moonscape out there for 6 months of the year. I just don't know how to, we can talk numbers and stats and science and studies, but just go out to the park and look what's there. And I guess 4 months from now in the summer, it's just a moonscape. It's just horrific. Doesn't matter whether it's organic or not. And I would say, all those ranches are being heavily subsidized. They're paying about 1/10 market value for the land, for the leases. So taxpayers are actually subsidizing those ranches. And the public doesn't know about this because, of course, it has to be hidden because the public will be pissed off about that. And Skyward Thomas, I guess, it's probably the most inefficient way to raise food for human consumption. A huge amount of inputs, food, water, land, 18,000 acres for X amount of jobs and X amount of ranchers doesn't produce a whole bunch of calories for 18,000 acres of land being farmed. And I could go on, but I'll keep it brief.
Thank you. Okay, we have, can I just one quick question,
Sure,
statement, yeah. To the extent that, the question was asked, have we thought about what the outcome is of, trying to return the park to its natural condition? That's what, the parks are for, and that's what the legislation that created Point Reyes and the whole national park system is to try to manage national parks and all the units, including seashores and recreation areas, to put nature first. What happens ultimately is hopefully nature's gonna be in control like it was hundreds of years ago. And I wanna say that the farms, the dairies at Point Reyes have shrunk lately because of basically business difficulties. But back during the planning period, the two biggest farms were 850 milk cows at the I Ranch and 750 at the J Ranch. And the other ranches were not much smaller.
Thank you. Okay, we're having our last question. We're running out of time here, so we want to thank all of our questioners and all of our speakers. I want to point out that there's a bottle of wine for each of you up there. I don't know if it was worth it, but thank you very much. Okay, our last question. All right, our last two questions, sorry. I miscounted.
Okay, hi, everybody. This is more of a comment and just an observation that I think we're all gonna need to do our research in the future. There's an old saying, follow the money. That's a really troubling issue. And I just want to speak to the Nature Conservancy and who actually backs the Nature Conservancy. They're not organic and they're not as concerned. There are people like Amazon, American Express, Anheuser-Busch, Bank of America, Coca-Cola, Colgate, Palmolive, Electrolux, General Mills, JP Morgan Chase, Walmart. I'm sorry, I said it was a comment, but I'm doing this because I don't think you all follow the money and realize who is behind all this and what's happening. We're being robbed, it's true, it's hard to digest, I get that. I think that there's a coexistence between the elk and the cows. It's coexisted for a long, long time. So why it needs to be disrupted at this point is something we're all gonna have to do our own research and really look into this and really know. Because this is happening not only in farming, but it's happening in the medical field, it's happening in a lot of places. And it's time, unfortunately, for us all to wake up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, our last question of the afternoon.
Okay, my question is for everyone in this room, and if you're feeling something, you can just like shake out your hands and feel your body. I'm a teacher, and so I'm gonna invite you all to join me in answering these questions. And I mean no shade, as the young folks say these days, which means no shame. It's an invitation to consider something. So I would love for you to raise your hand if you're willing, if you feel comfortable. We'll just like assume some small percentage of you don't feel comfortable, so you don't raise your hand. So those of you doing math, just like factor that. Raise your hand if you eat meat. Eat meat. All right, put your hand down. Raise your hand if you know the name of the farm that raised your cow, your meat. If you eat beef. Raise your hand if you have looked your farmer in the eyes and thanked them and shaken their hand recently. So I don't know how I'm supposed to trust people who don't know their farmer. And my question to all of us here is to consider, how do you orient to trust? Who do you trust? Do you know your farmer? Do you know your local environmentalist? Do you know these folks? And is your heart in it? And I hope that we can all walk away and like feel the feelings in our body and consider that perspective, and that maybe some of you would feel inspired to go out and look up your farmer and get to know them before you decide how you feel about all this.
Thank you very much. Have a hand for our.
Ask you a very quick question, 2 questions. Have any of you worked with Point Blue, who has worked with ranchers to help them learn how to rotate their cows and to conserve the land so that the cows don't eat it down to the ground? And the other one is, were any of the 14 or 12 farmers that sold, were they multi-properties?
Yeah.
They're public land, so they don't need mulch.
And I want to end on a happy note that I think everybody can agree on, that's sarcasm. Regenerative ranching is the clean coal of the cattle industry. There's no such thing, and we should have a separate forum with 3 ranchers and 3 so-called environmentalists debating that issue. It's just utter nonsense. Okay, that's enough out of you, Kashak.
Thank you all. Thanks for coming and visiting the Marin Coalition.